really grateful for the opportunity of coming and participating, and particularly enjoyed the opening salvo from Robin Niblett, which gave a lot of food for thought. And I'm very conscious of the fact that it's now our task to move down from those stratospheric levels to try and look at one or two issues in greater detail. And there's always a temptation with politicians that you start to be lured back to the stratospheric levels because it's so much easier to be there than to start looking at the nitty-gritty detail. So I hope you'll excuse me if I just say something sort of a bit stratospheric to begin with. But we're a very odd bunch, we human beings, aren't we? I mean, we have, it seems to me, there are three features to our existence. One, that it's finite. The second one, that the entire history of human progress has been brought about by the exchange and our ability to exchange ideas and cooperate with each other. It's what marks us out from the rest of the animal world, although some of the animal world does cooperate rather effectively, but in a rather different way. And thirdly, that we have a unique propensity for violence against each other. Violence to dominate, violence out of fear, and it seems to be a very deeply rooted feature of our DNA that we resort to it very frequently. In fact, perhaps to be just optimistic before I move on, it's maybe a feature of the last 60 or 70 years that in terms of global history, perhaps we're doing it slightly less at the moment than we've been doing in the past, or at least perhaps we've been controlling it a little bit better, despite the terrible scenes one sees on one's television. But that having been said, we have a propensity for doing it. Now, when one looks at what a UK government tries to give people, I'm always mindful of the fact that on Sunday I go to church and pray for quiet government, which I don't quite associate with what we're delivering just at the moment, but I won't be lured into Brexit. But what we are supposed to do, or try to do, is to deliver stable government and institutions that are able to support it, to improve the quality of life of our citizens in a consistent way so that their morale is maintained and their sense of well-being, and their sense that their span on earth is spent in a useful and constructive fashion. We have to bring about, to do that, economic growth and the preservation of a sustainable environment. Two things which I have to say I think are in direct conflict with each other and we have not yet succeeded in resolving. And in order to do that, I think we're probably in broad agreement that we can't do it on our own. It was within one country. It has to be within a neighbourhood that's sharing in those changes and is not about to destabilise or undermine what we are ourselves doing. And therefore, it means a neighbourhood which broadly shares those objectives and is willing to cooperate in trying to bring them about and maintain them. When I then look at what I see as a politician as the absolute key threats to those objectives, it seems to me that I can identify three quite readily, two of which I think are quite serious, one of which, curiously, although we're going to dwell on it quite a lot this morning, I think is in fact curable. The first, and I think the greatest one, is immigration and the mass movement of people around our planet. And I'm afraid it's a subject which politicians have ducked and weaved over for a whole series of reasons, much of which is to do with political taboos and the understandable fear that if you touch on it, you are going to release people from taboos, and therefore they will start saying things which are really very challenging indeed. And I keep on getting letters nowadays in the aftermath of Brexit, people saying to me there's a rise in xenophobia. Well, I'm afraid I don't think there's a rise in xenophobia. I think the xenophobia was always there. I think it's just that Brexit has allowed the xenophobia to be expressed by people who previously didn't think it was acceptable to do it. So we have a major problem here. And bluntly speaking, unless we are able to show the UK population, and I think the majority of it, and indeed this applies to our partners in our area, the European area as well, that we are able to secure and control immigration, then I agree with Robin's view. I think as a civil society, we are in danger of being sunk. And in doing that, we have to have some honesty in the discourse that we have about what immigration contributes, what immigration what challenges immigration poses, and an admission that some forms of immigration are going to be much easier to absorb into different human societies than others. And yet, extraordinarily, here we are embarking on Brexit, just as an example, pointing out that one of the reasons is now to control immigration from Europe. Yet at the same time, there are people who are saying that this will mean that we will then have large-scale immigration from the rest of the world and not willing to even discuss the consequences of that. And indeed, the evidence is it's going up. So I think that we do have here a real need for an international conversation. But that's going to have to be underpinned by some tough decisions. Because ultimately, in liberal democracies, how do you keep out people who ultimately want to come in? This was the problem Angela Merkel was facing in 2015. And she met it by saying Germany is capable of absorbing 1.5 million people. It's a drop in the ocean and will do us good and boost our economic growth. But in practice, the evidence is ample that it has caused a serious political instability in Germany, which is growing, and which may indeed threaten her political future, quite apart from being a probable precipitant of the outcome of the Brexit referendum in this country. So we can't ignore it. We are going to have to set up, and this is the irony about it, a regional structure for coping with immigration, because the immigration is not into the United Kingdom, it is into a region which is wealthy, and therefore attracts people from parts of the world which are destitute, and also where population is growing rapidly, and where the environmental degradation is getting worse, as well as poor political authority. And so I don't really see how, having left the EU, which I assume we're going to do on the 29th of March, we're going to have any other option but to actually talk to our EU partners from outside about how we do this collectively. We have an advantage of not being the first recipients of this migration, but we're going to want to try to provide further input into their thinking, because unless they're able to meet this particular challenge, then I think the problem is going to continue for us. And at the same time, we're going to have a far more open national conversation about what we do. Second issue is interconnectivity and cyberspace, something which takes up a great deal of my time as chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee. Now here, oddly enough, I am quietly optimistic. What we've done in cyber is that we've created an astonishing new means of exchange, communication, and ultimately, of course, the Internet of Things, but which is unfortunately essentially lawless space. And as usual, as often happens in human society, the invention and the technology has raced far ahead of the regulatory frameworks that are needed in order to address it. And of course, as things stand at the moment, there are large numbers of actors, whether they are rogue actors, whether they are terrorists, or indeed whether they are state actors, who find the lawlessness extremely attractive. It's a bit like piracy in the 17th century. All sorts of people will see advantages from facilitating it, including states where it seemed to suit their interests. But my feeling is that as this becomes so essential to global economic growth, and indeed so essential to well-being generally, that in fact the pressures on virtually any normal state, unless it's a complete rogue actor, is in fact to introduce order into the chaos. And there's quite a lot of signs that we are succeeding gradually in doing this internationally. And we are, fortunately in the United Kingdom, absolutely at the cutting edge of the preventative measures needed to try and control it. That's not to say that we can control it, but we are certainly a lead global player. I would have thought number 2 or 3 in our ability to make a contribution to this. So in a sense, this is one area where, although I find a lot of my time taken up with it, I'm off to the United States with my committee at the end of the coming week, which will enable me conveniently to miss the Conservative Party conference. I think that we are going to find that, provided we continue making a sustained effort with our partners, and again I come back to the United States but also our European partners, and make sure that we have a justice and home affairs system of cooperation post-Brexit, which I think we will get, even if anything else founders, I am quietly confident that we will be able to bring order to the chaos. and that in 20, 30 years' time, people will look back and say, isn't it extraordinary that we went through this period when the internet was a completely lawless environment? There were, in fact, plenty of easy fixes that could be done and were done once there was an international will to do it, to bring it under control without, of course, creating an atmosphere of authoritarian control as some would seek it. My final one is defence. And here I'm much more gloomy. I think we've completely lost the plot about defence. We have a problem that our environment is seriously threatened by a number of predatory actors. Now, in fact, they're not superhuman predatory actors. They are, for the most part, I suspect, perfectly easily deterred if we have the will to do it. But for the last 10 years, we've tried to pretend that we can do it without spending very much money on it. And the result is we have some wonderful technical innovations for doing it, but we have nothing like the necessary depth in order to deter, and the risk is, I'm going back to where I started on the human condition, that somebody will think it's in their advantage to try to use violence because they will be able to achieve their ends. And my personal view is that we're actually on a knife-edge tipping point between being credibly deterrent and not being able to deter properly at all. And that, of course, raises some really acute problems. How much money are we prepared to spend on this? And of course, looking at the human condition, it would be rather better to spend this money on things which might be thought to be more advantageous to improving the human lot, like the NHS, for example, or social services, or anything else one wants, one's roads, than pouring it in to hardware or training men and women to do it. But the answer, and it is the only possible answer, is international cooperation with like-minded states. And again, sorry to raise the Brexit thing, but Europe is moving progressively, even within NATO, in my view, to trying to achieve greater defence autonomy, that is to say, an ability to defend itself against external actors, without necessarily the United States' participation. What are we going to do about participating in that? Because it's going to take place with us outside the EU. The advantage is that both the French and the Germans want our participation and are likely to be willing to facilitate it. But it's simply crazy that we should end up with a situation where we're having to develop a global positioning system to rival Galileo. I'm sure we can do it, but it's going to cost us a jolly sight more than if we're cooperating to deliver one system for the whole of the EU and its participating states. And quite frankly, if we want to spend the least money possible on military hardware, which we all do, but we want enough of it, we are going to have to cooperate in every single project to develop the military hardware that can provide that deterrence. Those I see, as I say, there are three main challenges. There are lots of others as well. I'll leave Richard List to talk about some of the problems on terrorism, but perhaps I'll just say this. Perhaps it's a taboo subject, but I don't think terrorism threatens our vital national structures. Of course, if they were to get hold of nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons, that might be a different matter. But actually, these are, I'm afraid, very unpleasant pinpricks from desperate people. They shouldn't be seen as somehow turning our society upside down, but we need to take adequate steps to tackle it. And I think I've probably exhausted my short period of time. Thank you very much for asking me to participate.